Leeds, Leeds, Leeds. What is happening? Welcome to Working Hours, an oral history podcast about a place called Leeds, a time called now, and an activity called work. Working Hours wants to record 1,000 loiners over the course of this, the most important decade in the history of the human species, and ask them about what they do all day and hear how they feel about it. My name is Simon, and this is all my fault. My mission here is to try to map out what my city, Leeds, a city that has declared a climate emergency, did during humanity's biggest emergency. On Working Hours, we hear how loiners have, are, and will be coping with our multiple and expanding crises during their day-to-day working hours. Can we turn things around? We'll find out. To tell this story, I need loiners like you, dear listener. I need people in Leeds or people from Leeds to come on this podcast and just tell me what they do all day and let me record how this affects us. Thank you for listening. What did you want to be when you grew up?
Yeah, as I lived in Germany in a place called Duisburg-Rheinhausen, my parents lived close to a railway line, and when I was a child playing, I always liked to play next to the railway line, and even that it sounds a bit dangerous, but yes, yeah, because these trains, there was no sort of fence. You could just look at the trains, and and at that time we had, I don't know whether, probably all of them were steam trains, but certainly lots of them were steam trains. And I was really fascinated by these steam trains and liked them. And I thought I would like to drive such a train. That would be a really fantastic job. So that was sort of my first wish as a child idea. So to become a train driver. I don't know whether I would have liked to drive electric trains, but as I said, these trains with all the steam coming out made a huge impression on me. And
Was that an accessible sort of job then, do you think, for you then? Or was that something glamorous and a bit more inaccessible? I mean, was there a station nearby and you could just go, all right, I could go and get a job there and start driving trains? Or was it like, oh, that's trains, they're fascinating? And
there was a station basically very nearby, but I don't think, I must say at that age, I didn't really think about how to apply or do anything. There was a station which actually is in itself is a very interesting history, because next to it was where most of the people in my town worked. There was a huge steel factory called Krupp. It doesn't exist anymore. Now it's Krupp Thyssen, but it used to be, especially British people who were in the Second World War. Krupp was one of the major manufacturers of weapons. And so there was this big steel factory. And next to it was a railway line. And then when that, again, long time ago, when one of the last German emperors, Kaisers, visited the steel factory, there was a special train station built for him. And and we just lived next to this small train station. And but I don't think... there was just a sort of ticket office, and that was it. There wasn't anything to apply or sort of. But I don't think I even thought about it. I just thought I would like to drive this train, and I didn't have any person in the family or among my relatives who was linked to trains. They were all they, as I said, were either working in this factory, like my father, or another uncle was working as a miner underground, because there was also a mine in our town. But there was no direct link. It was just a fascination, and I didn't spend any time thinking, how can I apply? Also, I think that I was probably too young for it. And then later on, because my parents nearly never went on holidays, but every year we went to the local zoo, which is quite big and famous in Duisburg. And yeah, and I was always fascinated also by all these different animals. And then at one time, the director of the zoo was sort of trying to catch a whale, which because our town, the River Rhine, went through our city, and a beluga whale had sort of erred in its path and was ended up in the river, and there was sort of daily news about how this director tried to catch the whale and save it and bring it to the zoo, and I think he failed in the end, and I think unfortunately the whale died. But as I said, that was so fascinating that I thought, oh, I would like to become a sort of study veterinary medicine and become work in a zoo, and so that was my sort of second. That was already when I was a sort of teenager, sort of a bit older than when I had this idea about becoming a train driver.
You're listening to Series 5, Episode 11, and to my guest, Reinhard Huss. This is another Squadcast interview recorded on the 27th of February, 2024. Reinhard Huss studied medicine in Bonn and Nottingham. He worked in the NHS as a clinical doctor and researcher for 4 years, including 2 years in Leeds. He was a senior teaching fellow at the Nuffield Centre for International Health and Development at the University of Leeds between 2005 and 2019. He was the programme leader for the Master's course of International Public Health and has more than 30 years' experience in health system development and workforce capacity building. Reinhard has worked for 5 years in Zimbabwe as a clinical medical officer with additional responsibilities in public health, and for 7 years in the Central African Republic as public health advisor. He contributed to various health assignments in Africa, Asia, and Europe. He has a special interest in health sector governance and health professionals as social change agents, district health management, quality improvement of healthcare, and good use of medicines and medical equipment. Reinhard now dedicates his retirement time to the advocacy and research of Universal Basic Income, UBI, as coordinator of UBI Lab Leeds, a member of the Basic Income Earth Network, BEIN, and of Unconditional Basic Income Europe, UBIE. This is the second interview I did with Reinhard, and you'll probably notice that we don't really cover my usual questions here. That's because Reinhard's retired and because we touched upon some of the questions in his first interview. The first interview was mostly about UBI, which is why it's being released as a bonus interview after this one. It is also a really bad recording, which again is why it's being released as a bonus episode. It's also another reason why we recorded this second interview. I do very much encourage you to listen to the bonus episode, though, if you do have any interest in public health, social cohesion, and UBI. And if that's not your bag, what are you doing here? I will work on making a transcript available for it as well, as the sound is, as I say, very bad. There will be another non-bonus episode of Working Hours next Thursday. Right, let's do this. Episode 121 of Working Hours with Reinhard Huss. So, did you end up becoming, if you combine those two, I can imagine a kind of flying vet? Is that what you ended up doing?
Yeah. I could have ended up like a flying vet. No, but then eventually I decided to, when it became really serious, and I was in my sort of last years of my A level. Then I decided to study medicine, and it was, I think, a combination of various factors. I mean, there was a factor that I was thinking about what to do, because at the same time when this happened, I refused to join the German army, because in Germany at the time we had conscription and every male person had to join the army. But because of the previous experience with the Third Reich, and there is a law in Germany that anybody, a conscientious objector, can refuse to join the army. And so I went through this process. But then when you get accepted, then you need to think about a replacement, so you don't get away because without doing anything, because the conscription, I think at the time, was 15 months. So you need to do some replacement, and the two options were either to work in some social sort of care services in Germany, or to sort of go abroad and work for some international or German organization in some what was called development assistance. And and that again was very interesting for me because I did a lot of reading during my teenage time about explorers, Sven Hedin, Scott Amundsen, all the people who sort of had traveled around to to so-called discovery, but they just explored where people lived, and again, I was very fascinated by these different countries, and I thought it would be good to and interesting to work in such a country and combine it with sort of replacement of the military service and army service. And so at that time, then I thought, oh, what can I do in order to make this happen? And what could I study? And I mean, even nowadays I would think I could have also studied veterinary medicine, but at the time it didn't come to my mind. And also I didn't really have any sort of advice or guidance in terms of professional career. So I was just all my thoughts about what to do. And so I decided to study medicine because I thought this would definitely be useful to do wherever I go. And also I felt this was a good type of work which could be used done everywhere, and be useful everywhere. So I felt this was a good choice. And when I was at school, I also, in order to earn some money, and I was very good at school, so I taught some other fellow students to catch up with certain topics. And by chance, some of them were sort of children of doctors, medical doctors, and so I think, oh, that would be nice to work as a doctor. And so I sort of slipped into this path. And I think it was also helpful because in Germany, I think it's different here. You had, in order to get into medical studies, because it was very much sought after, you either had to have good marks at school or you had to be on a waiting list, because it wasn't allowed to just, like here, decide by interviews who is going to be accepted. In Germany. Everybody who has got the necessary qualifications in terms of justice should have a chance to study the topic. But if you haven't had good marks in school, then you were put on a waiting list and you had to wait a number of years in order to get accepted. I think at my time it was 5 or 6 years. So, but as I said, I was fortunate to have good marks, so I could accept it. And so this was a combination of factors, and I decided that I thought, that afterwards I would go abroad to work in a sort of low-income country, or I don't like the term developing country, but that was what is the term which is commonly used for development assistance.
So you kind of path into it. I mean, you had the marks. Was it straight into medical school, and then from there, then you thought about potentially traveling abroad and going internationally, or was that just always a thought? Like, were you? I mean, did you think of becoming a GP at any point, or was it always going to be in hospitals? Like, how did that develop for you? You know, from going into medical school, how did it become what it then becomes?
Yeah, I didn't ever think about even that. I mean, now obviously I had a lot of contact with our GP, but I must say I never really thought about becoming a GP. I mean, I always sort of thought about working abroad, and 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 so when I, as I said, refused to join the German army and got accepted, I sort of signed a preliminary contract with a German organization called German Development Service. And basically the condition was that once I had qualified in my studies that I would get at least 2 years of work experience, 2 or 3 years, and then after this work experience, I would then sort of be sent abroad, and that was the sort of idea, and yes, that is how it in the end happened. So I signed a contract with this organization, and then continued to study. And after the studies, when I qualified, went into to work, and after then there was a sort of time set when I should go, and and so then I went abroad.
So where did this end you straight off?
Yeah, there was a sort of, I mean, this is again a sort of really complicated story because, I mean, they offered me to either go to Benin, which is a country, French-speaking country in West Africa, or to Zimbabwe, and I decided preferred Zimbabwe. One, because I would have had to start learning French from scratch, and second, during my studies, I studied 1 year of my time in Nottingham, and at the time I was part of the Zimbabwe Solidarity Movement, because at the time Zimbabwe was Rhodesia. Zimbabwe is a former British colony, and it there was a sort of unilateral declaration of independence, because there were quite a lot of settlers, I think about 200,000, and they didn't want a sort of equal rights for all citizens, so they declared unilateral independence, and it became Rhodesia. And so there was a sort of fight of the black people against this settler regime. So Zimbabwe was at the time not Zimbabwe, but it was Rhodesia, and there was a sort of movement, liberation movement against the settlers. I mean, it was essentially similar to apartheid in South Africa, and at the time I was studying in Nottingham, and I got into the sort of Zimbabwe solidarity movement there, and was quite involved in the solidarity movement in Nottingham, and so that was another good reason why I decided that I would like to go to Zimbabwe, because I had read and learned quite a lot about the culture and history of the country.
Yeah, and then it's a chance to see it for yourself and sort of, is all of this stuff I've heard from both sides, like how true is this, and
Exactly. Yeah.
what's the situation actually like? What can I learn from this?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And my actually, it's also probably interesting. My reason to go to Nottingham to study, one of the reasons was as I wanted to get more practical experience and teaching, because at my time, the German studies, medical studies, were very theoretical, and the way the whole system is structured, you didn't get much practical experience during your studies, because in Germany, the training at the university hospitals, which are highly specialized, is sort of in terms of practical training very limited, because they don't see many average normal patients, and so you have a sort of hierarchy of hospitals, and the university hospitals are at the top, and they sort of see the sort of really difficult patients. And I was studying in Nottingham at the time, in Bonn at the time, and I think we were in 1 year 400 students, I think, altogether, so quite a lot of students, and there were about 400 deliveries at the university hospital per year. So there was, in theory, one delivery per student. And the consequence was that our teachers said to us, unfortunately, we cannot give you the experience of a normal delivery, so you better watch a few videos or record. At the time, I think it was not a video, it was just a film recording, but you watch some films, and that was our practical experience, for instance, in obstetrics. So I thought this is a bit shocking. And then I read about the UK and about their training, and that it was very practical and sort of hands-on training. And so I decided to apply to different universities in the UK for sort of a year of studies, and
Hmm.
I got accepted in Nottingham, and I also applied to Southampton, but I got accepted in Nottingham, and so I went for 1 year to Nottingham because I felt that I needed more practical experience, and that was sort of my road into or path into working in the UK, because I really enjoyed my year in Nottingham. I thought it was a good time. I mean, I enjoyed it socially, but I also enjoyed it in terms of training, and I thought it was a much better training than what in terms of practical experience. I think the German training is very, very theoretical, so you gain a lot of knowledge and about the topic, but it doesn't. It postpones all the practical training to when you are actually already qualified, and I think this is a big problem, or was a big problem at the time, and I think still it is. Yeah.
Well, it's one thing to read about, the theory of what's happening and, the descriptions of physicality, but a different experience entirely to be in a room with people screaming and blood. And, you know, you're experiencing different sensations there to what you would be as you're just reading through a book. So, yeah, the practical experience is pretty vital, I think, as well, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I fully agree. It's really vital, and in a topic like medicine. I mean, in other topics, it's maybe less important, but certainly in medicine, I think, in some other sort of similar topics, it's important that you have the practical exposure experience for your studies, and it is not good idea to just rely on theory and films and explanations. So, yeah, I felt, as I said, during the year that the studying medicine in Nottingham was very different from Germany, whereby I also deliberately chose Nottingham because it was at the time one of I think Southampton was the other one. They started a sort of new approach, which is called problem-oriented learning, where you sort of were more sort of focused on sort of trying to learn on the basis of problems you may experience in your professional life. So, for instance, they had hired actors who simulated to be a patient. I think nowadays it's common, but in many universities, at least in the UK, but at that time, as far as I knew, there was only, I think, Nottingham and maybe Southampton, which offered this type of training. So you, as a student, were confronted with a patient, and you were sort of in a simulation situation. You had to sort of, the patient may have had a type of cancer or some sort of disease, and you were sort of
Hmm.
expected to talk to the person about it, to explain it and respond to the reactions, and all this was sort of recorded, and you were observed by students and teachers, and then you could sort of look at your recording afterwards, and then it was discussed what went well, what didn't go so well, what could be done in a better way. So this was quite a new type of teaching, and that was another reason why I selected Nottingham, or decided to apply for Nottingham. And as I said, I found it very interesting and useful in terms of learning, because I think, again, this whole issue of communication is very important in health and medicine, but it's not really very much taught to students. It may be different nowadays, but certainly at our time it was not really taught to students, and you were just sort of expected to learn it on the job while you were actually doing it.
I mean, I've been working with a group who there's a lot of. I'm sure you're aware. There's like this big government focus on lived experience, and
Yeah.
let's talk to people with lived experience and trauma informed stuff. Um, And, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there, but a lot of the stuff that people are talking about is they're not listening to us. They're not treating us as people. There's this wall of kind of, I'm the one with the knowledge and I know,
Yeah,
and you're the subject and you will listen. And it's like, well, I'm the one that's sick and I know, and I've come to you for help, sort of thing.
yeah.
So there still is that tension in the relationship, I think. But yeah, I think it has got a lot better. I think the way healthcare professionals position
Yeah.
themselves and sort of discuss things has improved, but there's still work to be done, I think.
Yes, it has improved. I mean, I know now from my work at University of Leeds that you have expert patients, so patients who sort of teach and work with students, so that students really learn how patients feel and experience
Mm,
their disease rather than just reading and learning about it from a textbook. And so I think
mm,
it has changed. But as I said, at my time, when I studied, it wasn't really sort of a topic of high concern. And I would also say I didn't come from a family where communication was very or good communication was very well established. I mean, it was always sort of, if you wanted, I mean, it may be also a bit of German culture, so that you get told no means no. And so if I tell you no, then it's no. But some people
yeah.
don't.
Don't ask again. You've been told once.
Yeah, and but also this direct. I mean, so I've always had for a long time problems if people go around and about it without saying no to understand what they were trying to say was actually no. But
Mm.
I was waiting for the word no to hear the word no, and as I didn't
Mm.
hear the word no, it didn't sort of. I didn't understand it that what they were telling me was actually meaning no. So
Well, yeah. Why avoid it? If you mean no, just say no.
yes,
But
why
yeah,
avoid it? But as I said, people communicate in very different ways, and so
yeah.
especially if you are a sort of working in health worker or as a doctor, you need to sort of be aware and learn that people communicate in very different ways, and not everybody communicates in a very direct way. And also, as I said, there is also a difference in culture. Germany may be much more direct in terms of culture, to speak in a more direct way, sometimes even in an aggressive way, but other cultures are different, and they try to avoid this type of direct conversation and direct sort of approach where you clearly say what you want or don't want.
Yeah, I worked in a conference place when I lived in Amsterdam for a bit, and we'd phone companies all over the continent, all over the EU, and a lot of the Germans, when you call Germany, really directed, like for English people, it was like they would literally just say, "What do you want?"
Yeah,
And it was like, that seems rude, but it's not rude. It's just like, what do you want? Like, what is the point of this conversation? It's like, yeah, well, that's a fair enough question,
yeah,
really.
yeah. Yeah, that's it's quite common to be direct and sort of yeah. And sometimes for some people it can be too direct. As I said, I know it from my own experience, because another reason why I'm living in the UK is that with my partner I lived for 1 year in Germany, but she didn't like it because she found the Germans too direct and too aggressive, and she found it very hard to get on with it. And because people tell you in a very direct way, this is what we want and this is not what we want, and you don't do this and do this, and
Yeah, I had a partner that lived there for a year, doing like a foreign exchange, and she mentioned how people would tell you, if you were crossing the street at the wrong place, they're like, "No, go and cross at the cross." What are you doing?
yes. Yeah, yeah, I mean, I have a good. When I was before I came to Leeds to work here, I worked in Heidelberg, and there we all, because I was working in international public health, so we always had lots of international visitors, and I had this visitor from India, and in Heidelberg we wanted to cross a street with a red traffic light for pedestrian. It was red, but there was no car nowhere to be seen, and all the people were waiting on both sides of the street. And this Indian guy got his camera out and said, "Oh, I have to take a photo of this situation. Nobody in India will believe me that this is happening here. In India, they even cross the street when the cars are coming and trying to jump in between the cars. And here, everybody is waiting, even that there is no car to be seen anywhere." And he was so he was an anthropologist also by training, so
Mm.
he was so fascinated by this situation and said, "Oh, I need to take a photo of this one. Nobody will believe me in India that this is happening in Germany." So, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, what seems totally sensible in one context is absolutely crazy in another.
Exactly. So, yeah, people react to the same context in very different ways because of their sort of cultural background and how they see it, and what is the most appropriate way to act or to react to a certain situation. Yeah.
So I guess a year or two in Nottingham, then that totally prepared you for landing in Zimbabwe. You know, that experience of being in foreign climes and you've adjusted to being a foreigner in foreign lands, or was that another shock again?
No, I think I think it prepared me in many different ways. I think first of all, as I said, the training I really enjoyed it because I think it was very practical and hands on. Just in terms of obstetrics, as I said, in Germany, not in Bonn, where I was studying, we were just shown a video or recording of a delivery as our sort of practical training. And in Nottingham, I had to sort of supervise 15 normal deliveries, obviously
Mm.
with the supervision of a sort of experienced midwife. But as I said, I had sort of 15 times the experience, hands-on experience of a normal delivery. And so that was quite different. And that was the same in all the topics. I mean, I did some weeks in general practice in pediatrics and psychiatry and so on. So all this was extremely useful. And also, as I said, by chance, I got into contact with people who were active in the Zimbabwe Solidarity movement. So I became very active with them, and I even printed sort of at one time. That was after my studies in Nottingham, but I stayed in contact with them and printed posters for Mugabe's, because in 1980 Zimbabwe became independent, and before that we were asked to help. And so, I mean, nowadays I could bite my tongue, but at the time we printed posters for the election of Mr. Mugabe, and
Mm.
to win the election in 1980. So all this was and obviously there were lots of discussions about this Zimbabwe, so that was all very useful. And then I even just my stay in the UK and England. Often it's said England and Germany are very similar, but I again in terms of communication and culture and cultural communication, I realized how different people are in the UK in comparison to Germany, and I also found this very interesting, and I learned a lot from it. I mean, one of the experiences that I mean, obviously, I'm a very politically minded person, but also in Germany, politics seems to be a sort of common topic of discussion when you have a
Mm.
coffee break or when you have meet people. It is one of the sort of leading topics, talking about the actual political developments. While
Mm-hmm.
in when I was in Nottingham, I felt even among the students, and it was really shocking for me. The topic was sort of a bit shunned, and people didn't like
Mm.
to talk about it, and I sort of
Which is why we're not good at talking about it. It's like, well, if you want better politics, then you have to start talking about politics. Like, you can't just go, oh, well, we're not going to talk about that, or just all agree with each other based on something, or pretend to agree with each other
yeah.
and move on to something
Yeah,
else.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I fully agree with what you're saying, Simon. I think the reason why that was my impression, and is that sort of there is a sort of cultural avoidance of conflict and sort of with politics or political discussions, you may end up in some sort of conflict situation, which I don't think is bad as long as it's done in a civilized way. But I think there is this avoidance, and I've felt also at the time among students that. Many of them, there were a few who were exceptions and different, but many tried to avoid this sort of topic and just, because you may end up with some sort of very difficult discussions. And like, I mean, I remember there was, by chance, it was again very interesting in my group of students in Nottingham, there were two students from Northern Ireland, and one was a Catholic and one was a Protestant. And I think they didn't speak to each other, and I actually, because of that, I actually decided to spend some of my holidays in Ireland and also Northern Ireland, and it was really fascinating. And again, the Protestant student said, "Oh, you don't go there because the Catholic student came from Creggan Estate in Derry, which was a very famous estate where a lot of conflicts were going on, and." The Protestant students say, "Oh, if you go there, you will not come out alive," and so it was quite interesting. Yes, so. But I think that the underlying reason is that even nowadays, when I was working in Leeds, I realized many people don't like to talk about politics because you end up experience that people have different, sometimes quite different opinions about certain political issues, and somehow it disturbs the harmony, or you don't want to sort of end up with this sort of
Yeah,
situation.
I think it does a lot of work kind of protecting this. It's that sort of thing of everybody knows what normal is, but nobody thinks they're it. It disturbs that sort of, we're all pretending that there's a normal, like, agreed space
Yeah,
that we're all, oh, hello, we're all totally civilized and respectable here. Hello, how are you?
yeah,
Oh, don't talk about that. Oh, no, everything's fallen apart.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they don't. It's the sort of rocking the boat and being discordant, making a scene, that kind of stuff. And it's like, well, no, it's fine to
Yeah.
talk about things and get a bit heated.
Yeah, no,
It's better to.
I think it can be fine if it's done in a civilized way. I mean, in Germany there is a danger enough example for that. I mean, sometimes it can become really aggressive and very aggressive, and that can in itself be a problem. I mean, I remember one scene where also in a hospital with a doctor and friend of mine, and you see, in Germany, you have a sort of, you don't have a national health service, you have social health insurance. So most people are social health insurance, which is sort of non-profit, covering your cost for your treatment. And then about 10% are in private insurances, and they get a sort of, how shall I say, better treatment, or they have special rooms and so on. And
They get away for thin mint.
they expect to see the chief consultant and so on. Yes, and
Yeah,
everything.
yeah.
And
Concierge.
yes, exactly. And but then there was this situation where, this consultant, he went away on holidays, and so then you're always stuck with your private patients, and so he tried to convince this doctor and friend of mine to look after his private patients in his absence, and so that he could charge for it. And my friend Werner was saying, "No, I'm not going to do it. I don't agree with private patients." And as he was also the head of the department, said, "You are going to look after these private patients while I'm away." And afterwards, he realized that my friend hadn't looked after them, because he tried to charge for the sort of daily visits, and one of the private patients said, "I didn't see you every day, and there was nobody who came and see me, so I'm not going to pay for these private visits which didn't take place." And so he came to see my friend Werner and said, "Oh." And this friend, he was also had worked abroad in Tanzania, and said, "Oh," and this guy, the head, came and said, "Oh, you with your socialist medicine from Tanzania, I do not like your behavior and your attitude," and so on and so on, and went on, sort of really becoming very rude. And my friend, he is a sort of a sports person, and said, "Please watch out. I'm a sort of amateur boxer. If I forget myself, I may injure you, and you may get hurt." And this guy got a sort of really red head and was furious, but stormed out because obviously he was sort of a bit afraid that something may happen. So yes, so it became really unpleasant and nasty because he didn't like what that Werner didn't see his private patients, and
But I mean, he could have at least offered him the money for it, couldn't he?
yeah,
Given him
that's
the
that's
payment.
that's right. I don't think Werner would have taken it, but that he could have offered it.
Yeah.
But you see, I mean, that is another thing which is different in the UK health system. In Germany, you have one head of department. You don't have sort of several consultants in the hospital, so there's one
Mm,
head, and then you have lots of senior registrars, and the head of department is almost like a god, and because he can decide over your career and your future, and because
mm,
writes your references and so on. And many of them, I don't know nowadays, but at the time behaved like that, and so they expected that you almost sort of kneeled in front of them and said, "Oh, my almighty god, I do whatever you
mm,
like me to do," and
mm.
you're sort of,
Respect my authority.
yeah, sort of, and
Mm,
this friend of mine, Werner, was not the type of person who would bow to this authority, and that obviously upsets this other person even more if you are expected that everybody sort of kneels in front of you or sort of does whatever you want them to do, order them to do. Then I think if you get sort of somebody who doesn't and refuses, then it's even more upsetting. And so as I said, it's just an example that because in Germany conversation can be very direct, but it can also sort of become very aggressive if it goes the wrong way.
mm,
And
mm,
and I think that is the idea in the UK. You try to avoid, you try to be pleasant with each other, but
mm,
often you try, in order to be pleasant to each other, you try to avoid any sort of topic which may be
mm,
controversial, and especially politics can be very controversial.
mm. And then we save it all up for the weekend and go out and fight each other in town.
Yeah,
Oh, we're all so polite. Oh, I hate you.
yeah.
So let's get to Zimbabwe then. So what did you find when you? I mean, was there a? Did you go with a specific kind of mission, a specific placement in mind? Was it urban? Were you out in the sticks? Like what did you go for, and how did you find it?
Yeah, I went. I knew when I was offered to go there that I would be going to a very remote area, and because I have to say, I at the time my partner, she's still my partner. She's a midwife, and so when we sort of then basically decided to go together, they decided that we were sort of the ideal combination to work in a remote area because we could support each other, and both of us could, how shall I say, be doing some useful work. So
Mm,
I I mean, initially when I came to Zimbabwe, I spent or we spent 2 months in the capital Harare, and to get some introduction and some additional experience, and how to cover how to work and to learn about the healthcare system, and to learn about certain approaches and treatments which we may not have experienced or used in Europe. So, and then after the 2 months, we went to sort of quite a remote area. It's a sort of was a sort of in the southeast, close to the border with South Africa and Mozambique, and about 100 kilometers away from the nearest bigger city, whereby bigger city meant sort of city with 20, 30,000 inhabitants. And
mm,
the place where we worked had a few hundred people. And actually it was a deserted mission hospital, which was built by missionaries. And then they deserted it, but they deserted it because they've disagreed with Mugabe. That was also sort of political reason, because as before independence, there were some black Zimbabweans who were working with the Smith regime, as it was called, the sort of Rhodesian regime, and there was it called? It was Bishop Musareva, I think he was called, and they were linked to this U.S. American mission, which was running this hospital. And when Mugabe won the election, and then this U.S. American missionaries decided to leave the country and basically desert the hospital, and so they were
Mm-hmm.
looking for people to work in this place, and because there were not many trained black Zimbabwean doctors, and they were mostly keen to stay in the big cities. So we were sort of said, okay. And I actually was told by some Zimbabwean, you must be stupid to go in such a remote area and to work there. But we really liked it. I think it was a great experience to work in such a remote area. It was not easy. It was sometimes very difficult, but because I was the only doctor, and then we got, fortunately, because we asked for it, a sort of clinical officer, Zimbabwean, who worked with us, which was very helpful because in Zimbabwe you have, because at the time lack of doctors, you have sort of nurses who get some additional training. It's like nowadays in the UK you have the sort of consultant nurses and consultant midwives. So at the time they were called clinical officers, and they are sort of nurses who have additional training and can basically do many practical jobs normally are only done by doctors. So this was a person who was sort of sent to support us, but otherwise we were sort of my wife and I there on our own with sort of locally trained nurses who had been trained by the missionaries in the past, who were running this hospital.
So, in terms of supplies, meds, materials, tools, like, was it just you've got an empty hospital with whatever they left behind, and you get the occasional care package, or like how did it work? Were you working with nothing and just basic sort of like here, clean this cut and kind of I mean, what could you add with those sort of resources? Were you supported in any way?
Yes, it was. I mean, basically they had left the hospital with the structure, the infrastructure, the buildings, and but there was not much sort of or no support from the former mission at all.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, there was a sort of, how should I put it? Yeah, in Zimbabwe, you had the sort of government hospitals who were clearly sort of financed and supported by the state, but then the mission hospitals officially were supported or mainly run by the missions, and there are quite a lot of mission hospitals from different missions, and they were sort
Mm-hmm.
of run by the missions, and then got a bit of support from the state. Now, as this hospital was abandoned, it was in between, and so maybe that is also one reason why in the end I ended up in public health. So I spent part of my time trying to get a sort of equipment and material, and this is obviously I had the back with being sort of employed by the German development service. I had obviously their contacts, but it was spent quite a bit of time trying to get things like at the time when I started working there was no electricity, because this rural area wasn't connected to electricity, and the hospital used to have a generator, but it had broken down a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no electricity at night, and so you had to do everything with a torch or with a candle.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent time and sort of asking different international organizations to donate a sort of generator, and eventually we got one. And the same was with an ambulance, because there was no ambulance at the time. So, as I said, the nearest bigger hospital, it's called Shiretsi, was 100 kilometers or even 140 kilometers away, and so you had to call an ambulance from there in order to transfer a patient. And and to call, there was a nearby police station which had sort of radio transmitter, so you had to go there to get in contact with the nearest place in order to ask for help. So I spent some of my time to get, as I said, an ambulance and to get a generator, and another part of my time to discuss with the government to get more support for this mission hospital, because, as I said, officially it was a mission hospital, and you can imagine how government, state administration work. Yeah, you say you are a mission. I said, but the mission is not there anymore, so we need your support, and because we don't get anything from the mission, and so that was another side of it, and to just convince them to send us food supplies, and so, for instance, one of the standard phrases of it was in a sort of provincial administration was, "Oh, yeah, we have got everything in the pipeline," and so I said, "Yeah, I just want to know how long the pipeline is, because if it's very long, it will take a long time to come out of this pipeline. And if it's short, then it's fine, then we can wait for it." So, yeah, there was lots of this sort of improvisation. And also, I mean, in Zimbabwe at the time, it was a bit different from other African countries, where often it is expected that the patients are fed by their relatives when they are in hospital, but there was a sort of government directive that patients should get food from the hospital, and again, we had no sort of budget for any type of food. And but then again, there was a huge national park nearby called Gonarejo, and around the parks in Zimbabwe, they have the so-called safari areas where tourists are allowed to hunt wild animals. And so I spoke to the rangers, and so basically they sort of provided us with some dead animals, because the tourists just wanted the skin or the trophies, and were not interested in the meat. So they so they came when they had a dead animal, and left it with us to feed the patients. So but again, that was, I mean, talking about culture, that was not that easy at the time, because there's talking about Africa, it's always often assumed that all the people in Africa are the same, but there are huge differences. And like in Zimbabwe, the real good food is sort of beef, and so game meat is actually seen as how should I say, inferior quality.
Like low class, yeah. Common.
In contrast, where I later worked in Central African Republic, where a lot of poaching was going on, and they ate all sort of wild animals, but in Zimbabwe it was sort of looked down upon. And so we, I as doctor and my wife as nurse and midwife, had to demonstrate. So we also ate all these wild animals, and said, okay, if we can eat them, the patients can eat them as well, because they didn't want to eat giraffe and zebra and gnu and wildebeest and so on, which we got from the sort of local national park when they had these tourists shooting their animals. So I did a lot of this sort of improvisation in order to sort of keep the hospital going. And also I had to, there were sort of, I think, I don't know, 6 or 8 clinics around the hospital. I mean, because it was an area covering a sort of a radius of 100 kilometers around the place. And so there were very small health centers, which I visited on a monthly basis to sort of supervise the nurses and see whether there are any sort of patients with major problems, serious problems, who should be referred to the hospital.
Are you still hands-on at this point, or have you gone to, like, are you just strategy, logistics, admin. Like I'm running the thing now. I can't. Like, were you seeing patients
No,
still as well?
both. I was
Yeah.
doing that was, I mean, and actually that was it's at the time. I don't know whether it is nowadays the case, but at the time Zimbabwe was quite different from some other places where you did a lot of sort of what we would call public health activities like organizing vaccinations, doing supervisions of health centers, but also working as a practical doctor, dealing with patients, having outpatients department, seeing people in hospital and treating and operating on them. So it was everything. And on top, as I said, in this place, it was also because of the specific situation that the missionaries had deserted the hospital. It was sort of also or trying to do all this organizing work. So it was a huge challenge. I mean, trying to combine all these different tasks and trying to.
So what were the patients like at the time? I mean, what were the kind of things that you were seeing? Was it just sort of common injuries and stuff? Was it specific diseases? Was it just a whole gamut of things? Was there a lot, or were you spending a lot of time trying to convince people, if you're ill, come here, we can probably help?
Oh yes, I think it was a combination of I mean, it was a lot of people were sort of having diseases of poverty. I mean, tuberculosis, certain skin infections, malnutrition. Yeah,
Developmental issues as well because of the poverty. So illnesses, chronic illnesses later in
yeah,
life, and
chronic
so on.
illnesses. Whereby chronic illnesses were sort of a particular problem because sort of I think I think it's a cultural issue that chronic illnesses. It was difficult for people to understand or accept chronic illnesses. So many of them went to traditional healers as well, because I mean, sort of, if people had a sort of chronic heart disease or diabetes or some other hypertension, they were used to the sort of situation that you got treatment and then the disease would disappear. And so, if even the sort of what they call the Western or modern medicine could not sort of cure the disease, there was the people were always changing between sort of coming to see you or the hospital and also going to the traditional healer. So this was, and some people got lost because they stopped their treatment and then went, because they had a chronic illness like heart failure or diabetes, and they stopped it and then went to a traditional healer for some other type of medicine. Yeah. And
I mean, they didn't have to pay anything, did they? I'm
not
assuming.
not not not
Like,
not at the time. I mean, later on, because at that time I was always saying it was a golden time of Zimbabwe when things went relatively well, and then later on. I think after when I left, they introduced charges for patients who had to pay. But at my time, they didn't have to pay. I mean, even that they didn't have to pay in the area where it was a very dry, it was the low veld, as it's called, very dry area, and with irregular rainfalls. And so people often had very little food and so there was a lot of malnutrition and sort of, and to tell people, yeah, you need to eat better food is one thing, but if they have no access to better food,
all right, give me it then. Yeah.
or to eat more food, but also, I mean, it's always a mixture of lack of food, but also misconception. I mean, I remember I had a lot of children with malnutrition, but then they were given a bottle of Coke, which I call the sort of Coke disease, because people through advertisements and so on believed that this was really good nutrition, and so farmers, women, mothers. Sort of sold their crops in order to use the money to buy Coke and give it to their children, because I think somehow they had this idea that as a coke.
It's what successful rich people drink, isn't
Exactly,
it?
exactly.
Yeah.
So there's all
Yeah.
these advertisements and rich people, white people drink this sort of stuff. So it must be good for them, and so they spent sort of wasted their good food which they had in order to get money and then to buy coke, for instance. Yeah. So these are also part of the problems, educational problems, to explain to people how to. Deal with these issues, and some of it could be, as I said, addressed. Others were much more difficult to address. Some of these cultural issues, because they sort of, they take often a long time to actually change these sort of these beliefs. So, for instance, there was one belief. I mean, especially later. I mean, that if a woman cannot deliver in labor, that she must have had sex with another person. So that was a sort of, I don't know whether it was seen as a sort of a punishment. So there was this belief that if a woman didn't deliver in labor, that she had to admit to the person whom she had sex with before she was actually taken to a sort of modern hospital. And so obviously this could lead to disastrous results. You see, if you imagine you are in labor and then sort of being sort of told that you cannot deliver because you had sex with another person, and that is the reason why you cannot deliver, and so you need to first give the name of the person who you had sex with before you are sort of taken to a modern hospital.
So you're retired now from medicine. So you've had a whole career. Obviously, that's early on in your career. You've mentioned public health. So was that the experience that moved you more into, I'm going to focus in a public health sort of realm? And then was it just a matter of taking various developmental jobs? Like what was the next development in the career then?
Yeah, I think the reason why I went into public health, decided to go into public health, was that I experienced that a lot of problems I was sort of dealing with in Zimbabwe were linked to public health issues, or sort of more organizational issues and educational issues. I mean, it came also. I mean, I didn't mention this, but when I was in Zimbabwe working there, the HIV epidemic started. I was in the place, this mission hospital. I saw the first two patients with HIV, and at the time I didn't realize it, but it was basically because they didn't respond to normal treatment. And I remember one was a soldier with sort of genital ulcer, and normally if you find the right treatment, then they respond within a few weeks. They're cured, and it didn't. He didn't respond, and so it was strange. And we discussed this, and and then later on, I must say, I worked in this mission hospital for 2 years, and then was moved to another hospital in the north of Zimbabwe. And the reason for that was also that you talked about asking patients. I mean, in the mission hospital, there was another issue that, as I said, it was close to the Mozambican and South African border. And at the time, there was a sort of civil war going on in Mozambique. There was a group called Renamo, which was fighting the government in Mozambique, but also fighting in Zimbabwe, because the Zimbabweans were supporting the Mozambican government. And so these rebels came over to Zimbabwe and attacked villages in our area. And so we had quite a lot of really terrible injuries, because they really were sort of brutal attacks against villagers. And also we got from Mozambican side, people who were injured on the Mozambican side brought by an ambulance to our hospital. Why do I tell this? Because another bit of strange story is that our German embassy didn't all realize this, but after I saw, how shall I say, we had experience of 6 months, or was it even 9 months or quite a long time of sort of these sort of attacks, not in our place, but in surrounding places. And suddenly the German embassy discovered that there was a problem. And then they decided that it was too dangerous for us to work there. And so that we are no longer allowed to work there. And so we were moved to a place in the north of Zimbabwe, close to the Zambian border. And there, as I said, I mentioned these two patients I saw in this hospital. And then in the north, there were already quite a lot of patients because the HIV epidemic arrived from the center of Africa, from Uganda, Congo, Zaire, and there was a road from Zaire, Congo, down through Zimbabwe to South Africa, where a lot of minerals and others were transported, and that was basically also the path for the spread of the HIV infection. So, in the place in the north, you could sort of see how there sort of people, sex workers, were infected, and then how it spread. And we had quite a lot of HIV patients in this northern district in Zimbabwe. And so all these sort of things together made me think that public health is a very important approach to deal with it, because if you sort of look at it from a medical perspective, you just deal with individual patients, but you do not really have a sort of opportunity to deal with the underlying issues, the underlying problems, why all this is occurring. The same applied also, I mean, also to clinical diseases like obstetrics. I mean, unless you organize a sort of service in the way that it reaches all the women and convinces people that it's good to come to clinics for antenatal clinics and delivery, then you only see the patients who actually come to the hospital and be treated in the hospital. So in Zimbabwe, the combination of working as a medical doctor and also dealing with a lot of public health issues then made me really interested in the topic of public health. I would have never, I mean, beforehand in my career, especially in Germany, public health was not at the time a sort of topic talked about, and which was not sort of even mentioned in our studies. So only then it became sort of clear to me how important it was to sort of think about the organization of services and how and also the education and the political dimensions of diseases.
At the point where you were being taken out of the missionary hospital and sent up north, were you quite happy with that? Were you kind of like, I mean, you considering that you've gone to places that are kind of out of a lot of people's comfort zones. I also get the impression there might be a part of you that was like, no, we're needed here now. We're needed here more than ever. There's people being injured. Like, I should be here for this. So what was you kind of feeling there? Or were you kind of more sensible head on of like, no, this is dangerous. This is like, I shouldn't be here doing this. This is not what I signed up for.
No, I was also my partner. We were very, very upset about it because I always say in the good as well as in the bad way, people get used to everything, and unfortunately. So in the beginning, when we realized these attacks were happening, and then. That we got a bit worried about it, but then as it regularly happened, we felt we needed to deal with it. And I remember it was one time I was away traveling, and my wife and we lived in, actually that was the other. As I said, it was an old mission, and we lived in this huge missionary house with I don't know how had it 10 or 12 bedrooms, because it was built for all these missionaries coming to this place. And as I said, I was away, and then suddenly this rumor while I was away started going around that these Renamo rebels from Mozambique would attack our place, and so people in the village felt it was safer in the hospital. So my wife was telling me that there were lots of villagers who stayed in our house because it was so huge. But fortunately, nothing happened, and I would have thought it was unlikely that anybody would have attacked our place, because down the hill where the hospital was, it was a huge Zimbabwean police station. I don't think they would have attacked it. I mean, at least nothing ever happened. I think it was much easier to attack remote villages than to attack this place. So, but there was one day there was this sort of rumor going around when I was not there. Yes, so I mean, we got used to the situation, and I felt also this decision of the German embassy, which brings me to the whole issue of hierarchies. And I think the decision was just mainly to protect themselves. I mean, we didn't ask for us to be moved. It was basically the German embassy said, it's not safe for you to be there anymore after several months having worked under these conditions. And we actually, my wife and I, we were at the time on holidays in Tanzania and came back and basically were told, oh, you're not allowed to go back. It's too dangerous to work in this place. And yeah, we were really upset and annoyed about it and very frustrated, because we felt, okay, there was a certain danger, but as I said, we didn't feel.
Yeah, we're here. We know better than you. You're not here. You can't see
Exactly,
it.
exactly.
Right?
But
Yeah.
as I said, in my opinion, and it was mainly for the embassy to protect themselves rather than to protect us. It was just to be sort of making this decision. We are not going to let you work there and to be exposed to this risk. But I mean, I think there was probably a much bigger danger for us, which I think is always the case in these countries. When you work in remote areas, to die in a car crash or something like that, and to be attacked. Obviously, there was, I mean, there is a certain danger. I remember once, as I said, we got an ambulance, and once our ambulance, we took patients to the nearest hospital, and we were traveling back with some patients who had been treated, and then the ambulance broke down on the middle of nowhere, and so the driver and I, we decided to get some help, and all the patients, I think, we don't know, there were several, 6 or 8 patients. They were so afraid that in the middle of the night that these rebels would come and attack. They all wanted to walk with us rather than to stay in the ambulance and wait for us to get some help to get this ambulance repaired and going again. So there was always this anxiety and danger. But as I said, I don't think we experienced it as that there was a need for us to be moved. But as I said, when we came back from our holidays, we were suddenly told, no, it's not safe for you to work there anymore. You should go and work somewhere else in Zimbabwe. And fortunately, again, my direct superior in the organization accepted that this was completely crazy. So at least we were allowed to go back to explain the situation and basically stay a few, I think it was 2 weeks, to say goodbye and explain. But it was very sad and painful to suddenly sort of have to leave because of some decision taken from above. Yeah.
Do you know what happened to the missionary hospital after you left then? Did everything just stop and fall apart, or were there people there that could kind of keep some stuff going?
No, I think there was, as I said, we were always working with a clinical officer, so the Zimbabwean clinical officer stayed, so it was not so falling apart. And I think they
Yeah.
got also, because we had sort of also initiated a lot of support, so this was continuing. And actually, there was also a plan to renovate the hospital, and that actually went ahead. And later on, when I had time to sort of visit the place, I noticed that, that a lot of sort of renovations were done. But I don't think, I'm not sure whether they got another medical doctor allocated, because as I said, it was also not very popular for Zimbabwean doctors. There were not many Zimbabwean doctors, and it certainly wasn't very popular to work in remote rural areas. I mean, this was seen as a sort of punishment for many Zimbabwean doctors to work in such a remote place. but it didn't fall apart. I think there was. I mean, it always, even that, I think in real terms it doesn't make such a difference, but in psychological and political terms, it makes a difference whether the place has officially a medical doctor or a sort of a clinical officer who is not sort of seen as the equivalent. But I think they are very well trained and can do a lot of the work which normally is done by a doctor or at the time, because as I said, Zimbabwe trains its clinical officers in order to cover the shortage of medical doctors.
So we've been going for a while now. So I want to, because there's loads of stuff, isn't there? I mean, there's a whole career there. So
It is,
you know,
yes, it is indeed, yeah.
so we have got another interview that we did discussing UBI, which is something that you're involved with now. So maybe if we look at a sort of bridge. I mean, obviously, there's going to be various things that happen throughout your career and developments of ideas and so on. But I know from our previous
Maybe,
discussion
yeah,
that the kind of public health and poverty aspects of public health are very much linked for you.
yeah.
So, I mean, it's quite an obvious thing, but is that just something that you saw repeatedly reinforced throughout your career of like, so much of these health outcomes could be improved just from removing poverty?
Yes. I mean, that is what removing poverty and sort of other structural factors, like, as I said, if people live in remote areas, it's often not just the remoteness, but there is no sort of adequate supply of services and medicines, and that a lot of issues are not really directly related to medicine in its narrow sense, but related to social factors like income, food, and whether you have got
People that care about you and that will miss you and will acknowledge these things. It's like we often forget the social factor of health,
yes,
of
yes,
like,
yes,
and of care. Like
yes.
most people don't just will themselves better, do they? They need somebody there to assist in that process of healing and improving.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, my work in Zimbabwe then sort of motivated me to study public health. So after 5 years in Zimbabwe, I sort of thought I would like to learn more about public health, and especially the sort of international public health. So I was looking for training in this area, and so I at the time when I looked, I found in the UK there were three places where I could study something in this topic, and one was Liverpool, and one was London, and one was Leeds, because there was a sort of course master in international public health. And as I already knew Leeds from my previous, I mean, I didn't mention it here, but as I said, after my training in Nottingham, and I went back to complete my studies in Germany. Then I went back and came to the UK, and I first worked in Wakefield, and then I worked 2 years in Leeds, and a year in Chelmsford down south. And so Leeds was familiar with to me, and also as I had met my partner in Leeds, so
Were you at Jimmy's or LGI?
I was at LGI. I was actually at Clarendon Wing, and before that, I mean, I was at a place called the maternity hospital, which was on what is it?
Not Killingbeck.
No, not Killingbeck. It High Terrace. High Terrace. There was the hospital. It has been knocked down because of asbestos. There's now a mental hospital in the place, and I was in at the women's hospital in Roundhay. It's a women's hospital. It's now a private hospital, and in Roundhay. So. And most of the time I spent in it was just the year when Clarendon Wing was built and opened. So I spent some time there. So I decided then, among all the three places, because London is quite an expensive place to live, and I don't like this big city, so I decided to apply for Leeds. And also, there was at the time a very interesting teacher who is famous for international public health called Maurice King. He basically wrote the sort of first book related to healthcare in developing countries, and yeah, I was interested in him as a teacher, but also at the time he wrote a very provocative article in the Lancet. I don't know, Lancet is one of the famous medical journals, and he wrote an article about the demographic trap because he believed that people in developing countries, in low-income countries, would be demographically trapped because he said that people if you don't provide adequate family planning, people will have lots of children, and the population growth will outgrow the capacity to feed them in their countries, and they will not have an opportunity to migrate elsewhere. And
Very Malthusian.
very, very Malthusian. Yes, 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 yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. And but so I was, yeah, interested, fascinated by these articles. And as I said, he was quite well known. He still lives. He's very old now. He's almost 100 in Leeds,
Wow.
and so that attracted me. And because then we had lots of discussions. With this guy, and because he said it's a demographic trap, and I said no, it's an ideological trap, because all this concept that there is eternal growth, be it population, be it economic, is not sustainable and not very healthy. So we had sort of huge discussions about it. But it, as I said, it attracted me to study international public health indeed. So after my stay in Zimbabwe, I came back to Leeds to study for 1 year for a master in international public health.
Did you manage to stay with patients the whole time through your whole career, or did you get sort of more gradually drawn away from that over time?
No, since after Zimbabwe, while in Zimbabwe, I had a lot of work to do with patients, but after that, I sort of got drawn away from patients and basically dealt with public health, whereby when I finished these studies, there was sort of basically two opportunities two path opportunities to follow. I mean, after the studies in Leeds, I was offered some sort of position in research in international public health at the university here in Leeds, or the alternative was to go abroad again. And I think probably my interest to work abroad was stronger. And so then I applied for various jobs. And I remember one offer was to work in with DFID in the Solomon Islands in the Pacific, and another offer was to work with a German organization in the Central African Republic, and so I decided to go and work in the Central African Republic. And that was then sort of as public health advisor rather than as a medical doctor. I was still sort of looking occasionally after a patient, but more on a voluntary basis, because in contrast to Zimbabwe, I think Central African Republic, the services were extremely weak. And so once people knew that I was a medical doctor, they sort of tried to get sometimes medical advice, but it was more on a sort of voluntary basis rather than as part of my work.
I want to. That's making me think of other questions, which is why I'm pausing. But
Yeah.
I want to spend a little bit of time on sort of the difference between. So, firstly, I guess what was your kind of ratio or your exposure to kind of working in urban environments and rural environments, and what are the policy differences, or what are the things that you need to think about differently? Because we've kind of touched upon this, but and are you more sort of expert in one area or the other, or do they map across at levels? Like what? talk a little bit about the difference of public health in rural and urban contexts, I guess.
Yes, I think I would say that my experience is more in rural environments. I mean, when I was working, I mean, in the north of Zimbabwe, this was a sort of district capital with about 20,000, 25,000 people, but the whole district had about 200,000 people, and most of them were working living in rural areas. And after that, I actually spent one more year in Bulawayo in Zimbabwe, which is the second biggest city, and in a hospital and working. That was a truly urban environment. With Bulawayo had at the time about 500, 600,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
So, so I would say that my main experience is with the rural environment, but I have some with urban environments as well in Zimbabwe, and also later in the Central African Republic. Again, it was a regional capital with about 30,000 inhabitants, and but then a huge area around to a province with about 600,000 people. The difference, I would say, is that in the rural areas, the issues are different in the sense that there is often an absolute lack of resources for good health. However, there is, I mean, be it in lack of food or lack of water supply, lack of education, and so on. But there is a sort of more sort of support and of each other than
Like social
the
cohesion, the more,
social cohesion, which
yeah.
is a plus in the sense that people sort of know each other, support each other. And sometimes, I mean, obviously, there are also strong traditional bonds and strong traditional rules and norms.
And festivals and
Yeah,
things where
yeah.
they have meetups and where people will be missed and
Which can have a strong, can be very supportive and can have an advantage. Sometimes it can also be, I always say you have sort of cultural norms, rules, which sometimes are, they are favorable for health, which is okay. Some are neutrals, but some are actually dangerous or have a negative impact on health, and that can be very difficult to change. And sometimes, yeah, it can be very hard to change these. And often people are also not aware that some of these rules are not appropriate anymore because yeah, certain things have changed. I mean, a typical example which comes to my mind is using an example from Zimbabwe, that people had this traditional belief that if a woman got pregnant, that the milk of the mother was toxic and could not be given to the baby anymore because it was dangerous. So they stopped breastfeeding, which was often a sort of led to a sort of poor results, malnutrition, and that traditionally, in the real tradition, it was not a problem because also normally in traditional society, often there was an abstention from sex for the first year or 2 years, but this had been given up, and so partners had sex, and but this belief that once a woman got pregnant again, that she shouldn't breastfeed, still maintained. So you had one tradition which was very firmly in place, and another tradition which had been sort of changed, modified, given up. But the two together actually led to disastrous, bad results because the children were not adequately fed.
and passing on
Yeah,
immunity
yeah,
is the
yeah,
other
yeah.
thing, isn't it? Yeah.
While in the urban areas where he worked, I mean, there was often what I would call a relative lack of resources, because in the cities the resources were there, but they were not accessible to the poorer sections of the population. So, I mean, many of the things in terms of food and water, they were there, but these people could not access them either because the infrastructure was not in place, because often, whereby at the time when I was in Zimbabwe, it was actually still quite good, because they tried to develop the infrastructure at the same time when people moved into the city, so that they had a certain type of infrastructure. While in other places, like in the Central African Republic, there were just areas without any infrastructure, and people had to. So you had a sort of even a disadvantage in comparison to rural areas, where if people are not closely living together and you don't have toilets, it doesn't really matter, because people go just into the bush for the toilet. But if you live in an urban area and you don't have toilets, it can be a huge risk, because you see you have the whole area contaminated, and if
Yeah,
there's
there's 1,000 people going in that
yeah,
bush.
yeah, exactly, and you have floods because there is no drainage system, and so on and so on. And also you have, because people move together, they don't live sort of naturally for several generations in the same place. So you have conflicts, because there are different families, different ethnic groups coming together, living close by, and that can create a tension, because people are not so used to each other, and often also it's also easy, if problems occur, to blame somebody who appears to be a stranger, or appears to be different from your own
Yeah,
culture. Whereby, I mean,
yeah.
it is not, as I said, it's a highly complex topic. You also get the situation in sort of rural areas where people live together, which I experienced, where suddenly a person, often it's a single woman, a widow or so, is designed as a witch, and who has
Yeah.
caused certain illnesses, and then you really get into a terrible situation, that people get attacked and harmed, because they are seen as the ones who cause some sort of mishap or bad event in the village.
But I mean, that's neighbours, isn't it?
Yes, yes,
That's how neighbours be.
it is. So we are not that different. I agree. Yes, 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 yes,
It's like, oh, so and so's moved in down the street. I
yes,
don't like
yes,
her.
yes,
Ooh, no.
yeah,
Have you seen what they're doing outside
yes,
their house? Oh God.
yes, yes.
Yeah. Um. So I'm going to kind of start to wrap it up now. So we talked briefly before we started recording, and like how relevant your normal questions would be for this recording, and we discussed how you kind of you retired just before COVID kind of hit, and I would like to have explored some other stuff, but we'll focus on this for the moment. So I want to look at kind of looking back over your career now. Did you? I don't want to ask like a kind of sum up of like, was it all worth it or anything? But I was like, do you feel satisfied that I don't know, like this is a weird question to ask, because however I ask it, kind of loads the answer. I mean, I'll put it as simply as I can. I mean, was it worth it? What do you think at the end of a career was like? Did Are you satisfied with changes? Are you left feeling that there was more that you wanted to do? Do you feel kind of like I did what I did, and like how do you feel about the career now? Are you like you don't seem yeah, I mean, I'll let you answer. How do you feel about the career now? Sort of like, are you happy with it? Are you unhappy with it? Is it on balance, or do you have very mixed, complex feelings, or is it just that's just what I did?
Yes, I think I have mixed feelings. I think on one hand, I'm happy, because I feel I have experienced a lot of things through my work and through my places where I lived, which I wouldn't have experienced otherwise. And as I call myself an anti-consumer, I find this whole consumerism pretty boring and also bad for our planet, but also bad for our people,
Ourselves.
for ourselves. So I feel I had a sort of really huge range, wide variety of different experiences, and I feel this is, and I feel I, at the time, I tried to do things which I feel were personally satisfying, but also I feel in the best interest for, because I'm, as a doctor, public health, I work with other people, good for other people, or that I acted in the best interest. So I feel in this way, I feel that it was a good experience, and I tried to do the best. Even that now, looking backwards, certain things I may have done differently if I had known what I know now.
Do you feel you left anything undone? Do you feel that you kind of? I'm satisfied with that. I did pretty well.
Um, I mean, feel that. Yes, that I didn't leave anything undone. I may think that I sort of sometimes I wonder whether it would have been good to go into sort of for public health at a much earlier stage in my career.
Hmm.
As I said, at that time, I didn't even think about public health. It only sort of came to my mind when I was working in Zimbabwe. So I thought, oh, maybe, yes, in general, I feel it would have been helpful. I feel I went on my own personal discovery tour. It would have been helpful if I had had some advisor to guide me or give me some ideas and reflections on what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and what decisions should I take. So, I mean, for me, it was sort of doing things and then thinking about it and then deciding. But I did not sort of, I wouldn't think I had a sort of anybody who advised or guided me. And maybe that I wish it could have been helpful for me to have such a guide or advisor to think about why I'm taking a certain decision, and could I have done something earlier. The other thing is, as I said, I always try to, how should I put it in simple terms, try to combine a sort of position where I say what I would like to do, what I'd like to do is something which makes sense to me, but it's also serving some good for other people, for the community. And there I sometimes wonder whether my choice to go into medicine and public health was the right one. And sometimes I think, oh, I should have should have studied political science or law in order to be more effective in what I'm doing. But then again, I say, oh, maybe it would have had this similar sort of thoughts, even that I had studied something else. I sometimes feel, oh, there. I always try to sort of get a comprehensive understanding of an issue and what is the most effective way to deal with it. And I don't know that in my earlier life, I thought, oh, medicine is fantastic. There you get a sort of good understanding of certain issues and how to deal with them and what to do about it. But nowadays, looking backwards, I think, oh, maybe it would have been better to, as I said, to study political science or anthropology or economics and created a better understanding. But then I say, okay, maybe that is just the sort of outside perspective, and when you inside, then you realize that also there are limitations in these areas as well. So
Yeah, and who would have delivered those 50 odd babies in Nottingham if you'd gone into something more policy oriented?
exactly. Yeah. No, I agree. Yes. Yeah, it's just that. Yeah,
It's that sort of, if I could have been more effective, I could have been more effective if I could do this at a higher order sort of thing. But
exactly, and
sometimes it's more important to do it at the smaller level.
exactly, and to sort of to to gain a better understanding what sort of how it can be dealt with. I mean, we talked a lot about the HIV epidemic in Zimbabwe, and I mean, one of the sort of struggle was even that. I mean, when I was in the north in Karoi, and was sort of in charge of sort of HIV patients. I mean, we had several hundred of HIV/AIDS patients in our register, while the
Mm.
country, Zimbabwe, had notified the WHO about 15
There's none.
cases in the whole
Yeah.
country. And we actually, at the time, we even got a visit from the deputy health minister, because they didn't like in the government what we were doing, and said, how can you claim that you have so many HIV patients and you have not got the diagnostic means and so on, and you shouldn't state this. And yeah, so we had lots of discussions why the government was refusing in Zimbabwe to acknowledge the seriousness of the problem. And so there was one hypothesis that it would keep tourists away. Another hypothesis was that it would keep investment away. And another hypothesis
Mm-hmm.
was that that many of the leadership in the Zimbabwean government, because when they were fighting the Rhodesian government, they were in exile, and that they got infected themselves, and it was a personal
Mm-hmm.
denial led to a political denial of the issue, and so they were refusing to accept that it was a big problem. So sometimes I was thinking, oh, if I had studied politics, I would better understand why this sort of blockade is occurring and what to do about it, and
It wouldn't have helped.
probably it wouldn't. I mean, I agree with you. It's just
It's not like we've got any
yeah,
better at not doing that. It's like we still deny
yeah,
disease and illness left, right, and centre. No, you're not ill.
yeah,
You're fine.
yeah. So yes, but there is this sort of probably, yeah, that's always my search to get this really good understanding of an issue and how to address it. I mean, I mean, it's the same with our nowadays with our environmental and ecological and climate crisis, that I think, oh, it's strange that we are unable to deal with it, and why is it? And maybe if I had sort of learned more about this topic or that topic, I would sort of better understand it, and better sort of better be able to do something about it, but or contribute to it, and so on. Yeah, but I probably it's right. It would not. It's just a sort of illusion that.
Yeah, I think you could learn everything there is to know about everything and then still come down and like deal with society and go, what is
Yes,
happening? Like, why are you reacting like
yes,
this?
yes,
I'm going to wrap it up there because we're pretty much out of time. But again, I think we've just barely scratched the surface.
yeah. It's a long.
But thank you very much for doing this again and for sitting through me asking you inane questions. So yeah, I'll let you respond to that, and then I'm gonna hit stop.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for asking these questions. It's quite. It's really interesting and useful to reflect about all these experiences and what I have done. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, it's what you do most of the time,
Yes.
isn't it? So we should look at it more.
Yes.
If you would like to know more about UBI and get involved, go to ubilableeds.co.uk. Thank you again to Reinhard for being my guest. Thanks as always to all my guests, and thanks to you, Leeds, for being my subject. If you are in Leeds or from Leeds, if you are Leeds, then please come on the show. Yes, I am speaking to you. I still need to find 879 learners to interview, so being a guest is still the greatest help. You'll get free advertising and media experience, and you will be part of a unique project in our unique city, blah, blah, blah. You will enjoy it. You can email Working Hours at workinghourspod@western-studios.com. Okay, that's me. Work for peace and plan with kindness. Cheers, ears. Take care out there and be kind to each other, Leeds. Working Hours is produced, recorded, edited and published by Simon Treen for Western Studios Leeds Limited. The music was The Bees from Chopin's Etudes, which is in the public domain and was taken from museopen.org. Follow Western Studios Leeds on Facebook at facebook.com/Western_Studios_Leeds and on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/company/Western-Studios. Western Studios Leeds will help you realise your podcast for only £25 for an hour of podcast work. Need podcast production, recording, editing, or any podcast admin doing? Need it all doing? Do you want or need a podcast host or co-host for your podcast project? Then get in touch with Western Studios Leeds Limited. Email makemypodcast@western-studios.com to get your podcast made. I am available to third sector organisations, small to medium-sized businesses and individuals who want to make podcasts or create other digital audio content. Want to make some fundraising case studies? Want to show off your expertise in your field? Want some help creating your show and format, or just some support learning to podcast and getting going? Whatever your podcast needs, get in touch with Western Studios Leeds. Go to western-studios.com and use the contact page to drop me a message about either working hours or about your own podcast project.